So Cliff, The Cloud in Her Room, what did you think?
I found this film quite baffling, I must say, through pretty much, I'd say pretty much throughout the film. I was a little bit baffled by it. Um, what got me interested straight away in it was it's visually very interesting. I mean, obviously it's in black and white, and we talked about this in when we reviewed Song Without a Name, about how difficult it is to make, technically, to make a black and white film, because I don't know, it seems like this is masterly done, but I don't know how hard it is to make a black and white film. My gut feeling is that it's quite difficult to make one that looks as good as this film looks, but as Song Without a Name looked great as well. But I thought it just looked fantastic. It was just always interesting to look at, even when it was like industrial scenes or just ordinary streets. And I really liked the way the film sometimes turned negative. I thought that was really well done. So I was always interested in it, even when I was baffled. I really liked that sometimes it almost turned into like home footage of the documentary, the way some of the characters would speak directly to the camera, as if they were being interviewed about the events of the film. So that made it interesting and creative as well. I thought it was well put together. I haven't seen a lot of Chinese films, so maybe there's a lot of Chinese films like this, but one thing I liked about this film was that it wasn't really making any points about China. I didn't really feel it was making any points about China. It was universal, this film. It was about kind of contemporary living and a kind of, perhaps, kind of midlife crisis brought forward 20 years. It didn't really feel like it was about China. And I mean, not that I'm uninterested in films about China, but I thought this film had a universality, which just goes beyond the fact that it was made in China. Apart, perhaps, I guess the slightly odd scene of the children in the class room kind of displaying this show of kind of walking like models. Maybe there's some commentary on education in China there. But yeah, apart from that, I did feel it was universal. I mean, the film feels very fragmented and confusing, to me anyway. It's like I wasn't quite sure. I mean, the mother looks so young that, I wasn't sure whether it was her mother or her friend, or, it took a little while to kind of really be able to understand who the different characters were, and the stepdad and the real dad. But I think that was deliberate, because I kind of started to feel like the whole film was representing the kind of mental crisis that she was having. It was like a midlife crisis, but in her early 20s. I thought it was really skillfully done in this way, because I did have the feeling that she was teetering on the edge of kind of exploding, or serious depression or insanity. I kind of had the feeling she was teetering on the edge, but she was numb. She was numbed to it. So we only saw flashes of that, and most of the time she was just walking through the film like numb to it, almost like she's in a dream. I really liked the repeated visits and references to the old empty apartment, and it was kind of like a recurring dream, or maybe it was her subconscious, or I liked that. And when she touched the window and it fell out, that all felt very significant and slightly uncomfortable. Not a comfortable place, even though there's a lot of childhood memories for her there. I thought the scene in the cinema was really striking. I mean, I always love a shot of a cinema audience watching a film where you can hear the film and you can see the light changing of the film on the audience's faces, but you can't actually see the film. I really like that, just as a concept, kind of trying to watch the film through other people's faces. But this felt like it was a really significant scene where suddenly there was this. I mean, it was quite striking. Something happens on the screen, something big, like a monster attacks or something, and the mum is able to turn to her partner and kind of console herself with him, whereas Muzi is left by herself, kind of, she has to cope. She jumps, but she has to cope with it. It felt like this was quite significant about her sense of isolation. I mean, of course, the other really noticeable thing about this film is the amount of smoking in it. You don't really see that much smoking in films now, and it feels like that was very deliberate. And actually, I began to feel like the times when people were smoking were like the breathing space in the film. It's like the time when the crisis calmed down. It's like people were having like little quiet moments when they were smoking, or little gentle conversations. It kind of feels like the obviously the cloud in her room. It feels like the this is the smokiest film that I've seen for a long time, and I don't know whether the title is literal in that sense, in the reference to the cloud. So overall, I think, as I say, I did find this baffling while watching it. But like a poem that you don't understand, it kind of sat with me for a few days, and it kind of feels like it makes more sense now, even though I can't really fully explain it beyond what I've already said. So that feels to me like that it's potentially a really interesting, successful film, because it kind of gave me these fragments which a few days later, sitting together and making me feel like actually this is an interesting film. So I quite enjoyed, would be the wrong word, but I think this is an interesting piece of work.
I really enjoyed it. I think the first thing I would say is that it felt to me like it was kind of suffused with a sense of freshness, right? Which is strange given how much they smoke. And for one thing, I guess it's cold wherever they are in China, and so their breath is always clouding before them. But you could kind of feel the sort of cold air bristling on your skin throughout this film. And there was a sort of airiness to it that I felt opened it up in a really interesting way. And it reminded me quite early on of Joyce's epiphanies. Joyce was very interested in this idea of those small phrases that would somehow reveal the whatness of the thing, as he put it. It was a kind of secular idea of the epiphany in the everyday, those small pockets of meaning that seem to erupt out of nowhere. And I was reminded of that when there's a scene where the camera is on the daughter and the father, and they're sitting on the couch in the dark. And the mum comes in, and they're just sitting there quietly for a moment. And then the mum comes in and says, "Why are you sitting in the dark?" and turns the light on. And it's one of those like domestic, intimate moments that means nothing and means everything at the same time, in a very unshowy and careful way. And I found it kind of characteristic of the whole film. The reason I found it so refreshing, I think, is that, or certainly feels like, I've watched a series of films for the podcast recently that I just really struggled to engage with. And one of the problems I've had with a number of them was that it was almost like they were borrowing an aesthetic to lend a sense of gravity and grandeur to a project that hadn't earned it. And what was really refreshing about this film is that it borrows nothing from anyone. Its aesthetic feels it's very distinctive, very stylish, even expressionistic, but I'm not sure expressionistic is the right word. But anyway, very stylish, and yet that style feels very organic. I think it's a great example of style and substance being one and the same, because the film is full of kind of melancholy and these strange moments of intimacy. and yet there are also these kind of moments of heartbreak and gentle humor, and all of that seems sort of perfectly reflected in the film's style, which is very like seems sometimes from her point of view, as you say, and kind of like almost like found footage, like camcorder footage, and then sometimes we switch to negative, as you say, and so it seems to be kind of expressionistic, but at the same time reflective of the film's kind of deeper themes. And yet, and I'll get to this bit in a moment, but what I really admired about the film is that it's not straightforward analogy. It wasn't just reflecting her experience through the film's style. It felt like it was saying something much broader, almost cosmic, about the nature of time and experience. And it did that towards the end. There's that a brilliant moment where she turns to her boyfriend and she says, "A few days ago, I met someone." And then it cuts to the same scene, and there's no one there, and there's just this tree. And it does that reasonably often. It instead of showing us the conversation that you might expect us to occur at that point, the kind of argument or crescendo or whatever, it cuts, and it's like it reveals this emptiness beneath the experience. Time just slips under our feet, and as you say, it is kind of baffling in the sense that it's very difficult to reorder the film temporally. And yet I found it had a beautiful kind of logic and consistency, because that's kind of the whole point of the film. Because what I loved about it is it doesn't explain those central relationships, and I think that's really important. Like there's that moment with the mother where she's crying and she's drunk and she pushes her daughter away, and we don't know what this animosity is about. And the reason I think that's important is because the reasons and motives that kind of instigate experiences like that are ultimately irrelevant, because they evaporate. What remains in memory is the emotion and the experience itself, and those like singular images that seem to typify and characterize that potent memory or emotion, and all the stuff surrounding it that the more conventional storytelling concerns itself with, motivating characters and explaining their psychology. All that stuff disappears and dissolves over time, and I think the film articulates that really, really well. So it's a profoundly experiential film. But as I say, when it does those edits, it's like a very modestly radical technique to not focus on the conversation and instead cut to just a blank screen. But because it's been playing with time the way it has, I had this sudden like uncanny feeling that we'd cut perhaps forward in time, perhaps backwards in time, perhaps we'd cut to nowhere. We were just existing in this sort of absence. And again, memory is both incredibly potent and specific, and yet full of these absences and gaps that are they're irrecoverable. I can remember things from a few years ago like they were yesterday, and yet I can remember there are whole months which, I suppose it's fair to say I don't remember at all, because there's nothing there. And that's a really profound and weird phenomenon. And with the whenever I see negative on film, I'm always reminded of Tarkovsky talking about Ivan's childhood, because there's a moment in Ivan's childhood where he switches to negative, and he writes in Sculpting in Time that he always came to regret that, because it felt like he felt kind of affected, like he was using this aesthetic for dramatic effect in a kind of dishonest, attention grabbing way. And the difference here is that it felt perfectly correct, because with the negative, the image inverts, black is white, and it just reinforces this sense of instability and temporal flux, and again reinforces this idea that ultimately emotion, the story surrounding it is irrelevant, because the context which holds that story in place is unstable. And all that remains is the emotion and the fragmentary sense of experience, and a sense of self which is full of loneliness and melancholy and absences. And so what I thought was remarkable about the film is that it felt both fragmentary and unified. It felt both lost and completely whole, and I finished the film feeling very, very satisfied. And you mentioned that it felt kind of dreamy, and that for some reason that never occurred to me, but I think that's a really potent way of describing it, because when I recall it now, when I think about it, I'm not thinking about the story, because there isn't one as such, or at least not in any straightforward sense. I'm remembering certain images. I'm remembering that apartment she kept going back to, and when the window fell out. And isn't that just how memory is? Don't you remember when I went to the apartment and I tried to open the window and the whole thing fell out, you know? And I'm remembering her sitting there with her father in the dark for no particular reason. I remember that, you know, and that's exactly how experience and memory works. And so I think it's a film that is very rich, and I was really, really pleased by it, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's so. I think, you know, it feels like you're describing the experience I had, but you are able to articulate your enjoyment of it more than perhaps I was. But you know, when you said that it was, you know, kind of a film about emotion and experience, and it's kind of, you know, the emotion remains in the memory rather than the, you know, the story or specifically what was said. I think that's the point I was trying to make at the end, that, you know, it's like now it's like the film makes sense. It feels like the film fits together. And it is these fragments, but, you know, that's the nature of memory, isn't it? The,
Yeah.
you know, memory is fragments that make a whole for us. They don't feel like they're fragments, but we remember very specific things, say from childhood, that feel like a whole memory, but in fact they're a fragment which put us in touch with the experience and the emotion that then makes it feel whole. So, you know, I think you said it really well, but, you know, I think we actually agree on this. And I mean, you mentioned humor, and after you said that, I was trying to think if there was any humor in this film. I mean, maybe in the bar there was some humor, maybe in the karaoke. This to me felt like, you know, when I think about the emotion that I feel from this film now, it feels like a very somber film. It feels really somber. It doesn't feel like there was much humor in it.
It reminded me a little bit of, particularly with the smoking, of Jim Jarmusch, you know, early Jim Jarmusch movies. So the comedy, I think, is like that, very deadpan. That movie Mystery Train, you know, that really deadpan kind of somber humor. That when she's in the restaurant, you know, and he says, I'm going to give you a going away present because they're breaking up, presumably, and she just puts her hand out, and, he says, "Let me go and get it," and she starts counting, and he gets up and leaves, and you suddenly think, maybe that's the last time they see each other. Maybe that's how they break up, you know? And there's something both quite sad and touching. And so, yeah, if you're not funny, ha ha, it's not laugh out loud funny. But
Yeah. I did like the, you know, the point you make about the film being really organic and, you know, being about the ordinary. You know, this didn't feel like it was on a film set. It felt like it was, you know, set in everyday streets in a, you know, in an everyday Chinese city, which could be any city in the world. You know, it didn't, you know, the streets were really unremarkable, and, you know, the backgrounds, and I think that made it work. That was really important because it never looked staged. Although there was this weird kind of interlude, wasn't there, where they would, a couple of times I think, where they go to like that cave with all the water. That was more of a kind of set, if you like, but, you know, generally they were just walking down ordinary streets. And
yeah, there is a real sense of realism to the film. And doesn't it go to show that this idea that realism can only be articulated through the dour, somber, you know, kitchen sink, clatter the camera down the stairs, you know, that this is just that's a set of techniques we've come to associate with a genre called social realism. You know, it's got nothing to do with reality at all, and this film perfectly demonstrates that, because you can have something that is on the face of it really innovative and inventive and quite attention grabbing in its stylization, and yet feels perfectly truthful in its representation of experience. You know, and I think for me that's the real achievement of the film, to be both, you know, it kind of throws everything in the kitchen sink at it, you know, that there's as you say, there's negative and there's 8mm or whatever it is, and yet it doesn't draw attention to itself in a strange way. It feels perfectly appropriate, you know.
Yeah. So we both highly recommend this film then.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Good. What have we got next?
Next up is another Greek film called Apples by Christos Nikos.
Looking forward to it.